a year to make that zero by planting trees. And he said, I just paid more than that to varnish the back rail on this boat. Right? And he says, let me get my checkbook out. Right? And he did. So, if it's affordable, people will do this. Right? But if you have a 20-ton footprint and you got to pay, effectively $2,500 a ton, right? That's Toyota's charge for your footprint. Well, that's a big number, right? You got to shell out $50,000 to go carbon neutral. Well, some people can afford that. I can't, right? Most people can't afford that, but I can afford $100 a year, right? To do the right thing for the greener solution. And that's why the British Stern report that talked about the need to spend $3 to $4 trillion immediately to address this problem of climate change is such a staggering number. It's because they use that engineering metric to come by that number. If you use the green metric to come by the cost of making a really meaningful part of the solution to climate change, we can afford it easily. Right? It's very low cost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And it's immediately available, right? We can do it today.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The United States has historically been the biggest contributor to greenhouse trapping gases in the atmosphere, but that's changing now, and we have some other competitors out there that are going to do at least as good a job as we are of contributing those gases. And I think one of our biggest challenges is to work with those other countries to find ways to cooperate toward reducing our footprint and their footprint at the same time. What lessons can we learn from the voluntary system out there, and maybe moving toward mandatory systems that could be applied, that we could encourage other countries to follow, that may be large contributors in the future? And I'll take an answer from anyone.
Well, I guess I would just point out that under the Kyoto Protocol, part of the idea of having the offset project types be based in emerging markets is precisely to try to stimulate the development of renewable energy and other clean development in those markets, because as they mature and as there's increasing demand for energy in those markets, it would be nice if it was energy that was renewable instead of energy that was based on fossil fuels. So I think that's one very obvious way we can encourage the development of projects in those countries.
In every place in Europe you go, you see an advertisement on the wall put up by some public agency or some organization giving people an education on how to reduce their carbon footprint. Right? Everywhere you go in Europe, you find that.
I'm not talking about Europe. I'm talking about Asia.
No, but that's produced this fantastic effect of stimulating thinking. And the Kyoto Accord has been a fantastic success story because its job was to stimulate people to try to think our way, invent our way out of this crisis, and we're doing it.
It just seems that market-based approach would be the most effective, and if we can produce laws that will be useful in encouraging Asia, in particular, to move forward in this. It would be good to have that input from the market, from you guys.
2.5 months ago, I was in China meeting with several different Chinese government organizations. I was given tours around China of the tree planting that's going on there, and I'm a tree planter, so I know a new tree when I see one. I saw 25 years of extensive tree planting going on there in China. China and Costa Rica are the only two countries on the planet that are ahead of the game on forestry, planting more trees than they're clearing every year. The Chinese are enormously dedicated to climate change solutions. They're working on it. They are very insular. They don't really talk about it. I was amazed when I met with foresters there who were asking me about how to create carbon credits. I met with one group they about wind power. Some of these guys here are wind power guys, and they said, well, can you earn a carbon credit with wind power? And I said, yeah. And I said, well, and are you going to put wind power in? They said, yeah, we're looking at 250 megawatts right away, in one little area. And they said, can we earn a carbon credit for that? And I said, well, of course, So those countries are, in fact, actually very working on it. On the other side of the equation, they're burning the nastiest coal on Earth. All the, the mercury that we worry about in tuna in the open ocean, where does it come from? It all comes from Chinese coal pollution, right? That's why the mercury suddenly appeared, in the fish world, right? Is that mercury has come from those Chinese coal plants. So we got to shut those things down with other means and for other purposes other than strictly climate change, right?
To get to your question, I think the rate of development in countries like China and India is going to have to be met with intelligent cap and trade regulations that they're going to have to sign on to spur clean energy technologies and carbon sequestration. I think that they're not going to act. I'm sure if you've talked to them, they're not going to act until we take some action ourselves. So I think the first step is the development of a U.S. mandatory regime, and then working with them as quickly as possible to get them to develop a mandatory regime.
In China, every man, woman, and child by law in China has to plant 5 trees per year. That's 6 billion trees per year go in the ground. And everywhere in China where you go, if you're an old tree planter like me, you see that that's going on. I see those trees are in the ground growing. So they're working on it.
Okay, thank you. Time's expired. The gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I'm intrigued, Mr. George, by your comment about what great foresters the Chinese are, because there was an extensive series of articles, or at least one article in the Washington Post recently about all the illegal logging that's going on in China. And despite their rules, they're incapable of enforcing them in the provinces. So I'm glad that your view on that is a different picture than what we read in the Post, because that was pretty devastating in terms of the harvest levels there. Russia, Indonesia, Malaysia, other tropical countries where the rainforests are being wiped out so they can ship the wood to China, so they can process it into furniture, so we can buy it here and feel good about ourselves, I guess. So I'm glad to hear they're doing more in China than what we read. It strikes me too that in China we're told that they're putting 2 500-megawatt coal-burning power plants online. I think it's every week this year. Mr. Rahm, is that?
Yeah, no, it's staggering. It's like the equivalent of a new California every year.
And isn't that why somehow, by hook or crook, we need to get China and India and the other big carbon emitters in with us globally to address this issue?
The Premier of China did commit about 2 months ago when he was visiting with the Premier of Japan, Prime Minister of Japan, that China would be a full compliant member of Kyoto beginning in the second period following 2012.
Well,
they have made that commitment.
Mr. Jordan, I'm glad to hear the commitments. I've seen it in trade issues, too, where they've made a lot of commitments, and, gosh, some of them aren't always followed. And I actually supported putting China in WTO so we'd have international compliance and all. But so I'm glad if he's making that level of commitment.
Those coal plants are the ugliest thing on earth. I've been by a bunch of them.
Well, Mr. Rahm, let's continue on with this, because I know they're also committed to do other energy sources. But are they using the latest technologies in these new plants they're putting in line? Do you know?
No, they're not, and they're using, I think by and large, they're using pulverized coal, which may be very difficult to retrofit to capture carbon. I think the top priorities for the United States should be to develop a mandatory regime ourselves, just so we have credibility to go to other countries. If you've talked to people from China and India, you know that they scoff at the notion that the poor countries shouldn't, that the rich countries can't act until the poor countries act, but they're going to have to act right after we act. So I think we need to do something for our own credibility. I also think we have to figure out how to do this technology transfer, because they're going to build coal plants.
Right.
And so we have to figure out how to make sure that they build coal plants that can capture carbon and work with them to figure out how and where to sequester it.
Who among you is sort of up on sequestration? Because when some of us were in Europe earlier this summer, we went out to a coal plant where they were working on a sequestration facility, although we didn't end up getting to see that facility itself. But my understanding is that that's still pretty experimental in trying to actually sequester carbon.
Yeah,
coal
I mean,
plant.
we haven't, the Bush administration has Future Gen, which
Right.
I think is kind of a very slow process that won't demonstrate the successful integration of everything for 10 years for sequestration. I think, frankly, the top priority of the federal government should be to A, start doing demonstration projects, which I think are occurring, but B, someone's got to go out and identify and certify geologic repositories.
Right. In fact, that was an issue that came up in Europe. They actually have on their books in some countries, I'm told, anti-pollution laws, and they treat carbon as a pollutant. And so they've got to modify their law because you can't put pollutants in the ground legally. So once they figure out how to sequester carbon, they've got to fix their law because otherwise you're injecting a pollutant into the ground in violation of their law. The other issue that came up in our discussions was not only how you resolve that, which could be done, but how do you, are there other liability issues that could occur? Does carbon injected into the ground force something else out that you become liable for? Does it escape at some point? And therefore, how do you deal with the escape gas if it does? Are you familiar with any of
Sure.
these
Well,
sorts of-
the answer to the questions, they're all good questions, and no one has addressed them formally in any consensus-based process. And I would certainly urge again, the committee or the government to pursue that aggressively, because carbon dioxide is an invisible gas.
Right.
It is exceedingly difficult to detect,
Right.
and in a worst-case scenario, a massive leak of carbon dioxide would cause harm.
Well, in fact, there's that lake I just saw.
Lake
where,
in Africa, absolutely,
yeah,
yes.
where if the bubble pops, it could kill everybody around there because it would inundate them with carbon. And
So people may not be thrilled to have a large carbon dioxide repository in their backyard, and I think setting up a certification process,
point.
is a very urgent thing. I mean, look, it's taken, how long have we been trying to certify one nuclear repository?
Yeah.
I don't think it'll be as hard to certify a carbon repository, but we're going to need dozens of them.
Maybe
So-
we can put them both there in Yucca Mountain. What do you think? My time's expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your comments. Those are issues.
Thank you, gentlemen. Yucca Mountain won't be storing nuclear waste in the near future, so maybe it's something that could purpose. So here's what I'd like. I'd like each of the witnesses to give us their 1-minute summation, what it is that you want the Select Committee to remember from your testimony as we move forward over the course of the next several months and a couple of years looking at this issue. Let's begin with you, Mr. Boucher, if you would give us your final 1 minute.
Thank you. Despite our position in the voluntary carbon offsets market, I think the one thing we would like to see Congress do as soon as possible is a well-designed mandatory cap and trade put in place. And I think the evolving voluntary market will continue to support that. It'll help folks get from whatever level is established by mandates to net zero for those who want to get there. The other point I wanted to make is that in designing that, it has to be very well designed so that the mandatory cap and trade does not strip away the benefits of renewable energy projects in particular, in the same way that has occurred on SO2 cap and trading, in that basically any reduction from a renewable project goes to the benefit of the utility. Utility then has additional allowances it can sell. There has to be direct allocation of rights to the renewable energy projects to preserve the voluntary market in that future cap and trade regime. There's been discussion about voluntary, the gold standard, and I'd just like to note for the record that we are working with Gold Standard to bring forward the first gold standard certified project in the U.S., and we expect that to happen later this year. It will be the Owl Feather War Bonnet project on the Rosebud Reservation. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. George.
Well, I think you should, pay attention to the fact that there are, sides